attend to. Your Honour, just a number of non-publication orders in the proceedings, including overruling number 3 in Exhibit 22. We advise that causes some of the parties in the Supreme Court some difficulty because technically the non-publication orders would prevent disclosure to that court.
Yes.
So I just seek a variation to those orders to add an additional exception that permits disclosure to the Supreme Court of the Northern Territory for the purposes of proceeding 02673 of 2022.
Yes, I don't wish to say anything further. I'll make that variation to the non-publication order and that will be added to the website.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. Senior Constable, my name is Mullins. I appear on behalf of the Brown family. I will be brief. I just have 3 topics that I want to ask you about relating to communication. The first one is that, am I right to say that almost all of the Indigenous people in a community will have English as their second language?
At best.
Yes.
Yeah. At best?
At a minimum, a second language, yes.
Yes. And so that has been your experience in communities?
Yeah, well, my grandmother spoke English as a 5th language, so it's not uncommon.
So when one is going through the mechanism of enforcing laws, as you do, the interaction between the police officer and a person in the community can be complicated by language problems.
It's exceptionally difficult. The ability for people that speak English as a 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th language to understand the contextually complex English can be difficult.
Well, I'm not a language expert, but one can simply see a number of problems. Firstly, that the police officer has the capacity to understand that the message he's conveying is being understood. That's one line of communication that's problematic. The second line is that the person who's listening to the direction from the police officer may or may not understand what's being conveyed to them. So there's a misunderstanding there. And the third is that the person who is being given the direction, that is the community member, in trying to convey something back, may have some limitations in that.
That's correct.
Now, we've heard some evidence from a health person who has said that they preferred, when they were dealing with people in the community, in having a family member present to assist in the communication issues. Mm-hmm. And obviously, having an ACPO present for a police officer in a non-urgent situation is the best way to manage that potential language difficulty.
If the ACPO speaks that language or a language other than English.
Are there any ways you can think otherwise to manage it, that situation?
Look, it's difficult when you're working regionally and remotely to always have somebody available to give you that language assistance. Sometimes the calls that we respond to are urgent in type and require a quick response. Sometimes the situations that we can be going into can be dynamic and violent. So in best practice, would it be good to have somebody there that can communicate in that first language? 100% agree. Is it always practicable? No.
And you confront that situation in Alice Springs on a regular basis, don't you?
Yes.
And how do you manage it in terms of ensuring that you are conveying a message and the message is being understood?
The best way that I can, which is by utilisation of direct base language. So not being extravagant in my choice of use of the English language.
The second point is related to communication, but it's the use of time as being a measurement or a tool through which to request something be done. So if as I understand, in many of the communities and in your experience, is it the case that people are pretty flexible about times?
At times, pardon the pun, at times, yes.
So if one was to say you need to hand yourself in before midday, as a direction, that may be difficult for a person within the community to comply with.
I wouldn't say so. I would say that if there's been some form of conversation around somebody handing themselves into the police station, that there'd be a conceptual understanding of the timeframes involved.
Are there any other alternatives to using a nominated time that you can think of?
Well, it depends on the circumstances, and it depends on the type of offence that you're dealing with, the veracity of the potential for the commission of further offence, or for people to be injured, or, you know, like, that's a very open-ended question. So
It may have been imprecise, and I apologise. It was more, can you think of any other alternatives other than saying, come in by 12 o'clock? If you want the person to come in at around the middle of the day.
well, you'd ask people to come in during the daytime to see you if they're going to hand themselves in, yes.
The third thing is the interface between the elders and police within the community. From your own experience, is it important that there be an exchange of information between elders and the police in the community?
Absolutely.
And what sort of form would you see that taking?
Well, it depends on what already exists within the community. The police run community safety meetings, or CSAP, community safety access. I can't remember the exact pseudonym, excuse me, but remote police officers do conduct meetings with the communities on a regular basis to talk about issues, problems, how they can assist each other going forward, and it involves not only the police but other NGOs and government organisations. I think that interface with elders within the community space is very important.
And in the context of the balancing of the two responsibilities, on the one hand, the police are effectively policing the community, and the elders are trying to assist in that process. Do you think that the power of the elders in the last decade or so has been emasculated to some extent by the things that you've observed?
I wouldn't say emasculated, I would say diminished. Yes, and it's not from any fault of the communities. I think it's the fault of wider government policy. I don't think that the police could be labelled with the people that are responsible for that emasculation. I think that that's a wider Australian government issue.
And is it fair to say that a strong authoritarian, sorry, that's the wrong word, a strong and empowered community of elders will assist in the police in policing rather than the contrary?
Oh, absolutely, 100%.
Nothing further. Thank you.
Constable, I asked you some questions, and then apologies, thanks to me, that you're back here again, having to sit here for a few more hours. Having protested at you coming back, I probably don't have too many questions, so I will try and be brief. I just want to return to something I asked you about last time, which was your time working on in the shires and running night patrols. You touched on underlying issues of poverty is something that unfortunately connects people to the justice system, and spoke to some extent about the importance of employment and that sort of thing, and empowerment in communities. We heard yesterday about the use of security guards at the local clinics. It's also been discussed in the context of other communities. Sorry, we heard this conversation in Undamoot, of course, we were there. The training, clearances, etc., the qualifications required for night patrol staff, is it, to your knowledge, would there be much more required for people with those qualifications in night patrol to get qualifications as security guards, for example?
It's interesting. The when I was working with Night Patrol in 2009, 2010, we developed a base course program in conjunction with a registered training organisation in Alice Springs, Eagle Training, which is directed by Gary Carter. And Gary, on behalf of Central Desert Shire, he moulded a night patroller's course that gave a base level of skills, but also gave them a certificate 1 in security and a certificate 2 in security. So those people would have been able to gain employment outside of the night patrol sphere of operations.
So,
If that's been continued, I'm unsure, but
so potentially employment of people like Talis Security that look after the courthouse.
absolutely.
So, from the perspective of Indigenous empowerment, do you think that would be a positive thing or a good idea for whether it's the Department of Health or other services in the community to look towards employing local people in those sort of security roles?
Yes, absolutely. I know the Yiprinya Centre in Alice Springs employs Aboriginal people in the role of security officers, and it has shown great benefits because they're able to mediate and deal with issues in a different way to what non-Aboriginal people could. And I know that Kmart's been utilising some Aboriginal security officers there, and it's reduced the issues that they're seeing in their store without any further intervention. It's just the fact that there's a senior Aboriginal male or female that's performing that role and function.
And similar question applies to having more Aboriginal police officers in that your interactions somewhere like Alice Springs, where people know you, familiar with your face and who you are, and you may have some knowledge or connection that it's perhaps quite a different interaction that you may have, or different attitude that people may have when you approach or similarly with the security guard approach.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can be, I'd like to think that everybody likes me, but I know it's quite the contrary. There's been members of this community that don't like me, but when you are a part of your community, your ability to deal with the community on a base level is evident through interactions. So, and I don't think that it's beneficial to be an Aboriginal person working in an Aboriginal space, but for anybody, if you are working as a police officer in a remote community and you sit in your house and you don't go and interact with the community, don't go to the local store, don't get involved with the local sports, and it's one of the things that I talk about in the small training packages that I do at the college is about networking, and through networking you can create cultural brokerage. So if you don't make the effort to be a part of the community, then life's not going to be as easy as it could be for you.
To some extent, it's a protective or preventative factor, having positive relationships in the community. You agree?
Oh, absolutely. It's important on a number of levels. I mean, on a human level, it's good to have interaction day to day with people. On a policing level, you're a police officer, but we're civilian police officers. We're members of our community. We're not a military organisation. We are representatives of the people that we police.
Unfortunately, there are occasions where coming in situations and trying to resolve things peacefully. Things happen in the spur of the moment, and often, and unfortunately, force may need to be used in apprehending someone, for example. You described yourself and other Aboriginal people having not so positive or negative interactions with for example, any occasion where someone has to be arrested quite forcefully, whether it's them or children observing that, for example, that itself can be traumatic.
Absolutely.
And obviously, you can't always avoid that, but where possible, being conscious of avoiding those sort of situations is important for the kind of long-term relationship that people have with the police and
Yeah.
the perception of the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as police officers, we're just people. We're nothing special. And like people, we're individuals. We're all different. We all carry a different life experience, a different education base, a different understanding, a different ability to mediate or problem solve or liaise with community members, whether they're Indigenous, non-Indigenous, or from any other ethnicity. So, you know, to say that all police officers can work off the same base is a fallacy, because we're made up of a cross section of our society.
Would you say that situations where the perception of interacting with someone is that because they know you or because they have they see an Aboriginal face that they're a bit more relieved or a bit more cooperative simply by your presence?
Absolutely. I won't deny that. It can make a huge difference, but it can have a negative effect as well, which the majority of the time interactions of what you're describing are positive, but occasionally you'll have somebody that won't want to deal with me because they know that I'm from the local community, and sometimes it's dependent on the crime type that they're involved with. Sometimes it can be a factor that they are embarrassed that somebody they know knows that they're a suspect in a certain crime type, and that can be an issue. But generally, being a local police officer and having links to the local community leads to peaceful resolutions more times than not.
And you obviously have not only your personal knowledge, family and cultural knowledge, you have a master's degree in Indigenous knowledge. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You've done things like Marong, etc. So you'd agree there's certainly a lot more training around Indigenous knowledge that would benefit.
Absolutely. So
many officers.
one thing when Dr. Dwyer asked me about the Maal-Rom program that I forgot to mention was that the Maal-Rom program, when it was re-established in 2007-2008, was actually co-funded by the Australian Federal Police. It was a very positive interaction between the AFP and the Maal-Rom program, because the police could see the benefits that that program could bring into that organisation that I was working for at that time.
And correct me if I'm wrong, were there some aspects of that Marong that included mediation skills?
Yes.
Or was that a significant part of the program?
Yeah, that formed, well, it was a crossover between contemporary Western style of mediation. So we actually went to CDU and did a unit that gave us a certificate in mediation, and we did traditional ceremonial mediation practice, which is the actual ceremony, which is Maal-Rom.
Incorporating that sort of training into police, would you think that's something all police would benefit from, that work with the Indigenous community?
Any training that assists police to be able to deal more effectively with any cross-section of the community that they deal with is beneficial. I would like to say that we've got an unlimited budget and that we've got unlimited time, but it's quite the contrary. But I do agree that there probably does need to be more focus on providing people with an effective understanding of what the community they're going to be working with before they're...
Aspects of that program or other aspects such as mediation, would you agree that that's something that other people in communities such as your law and justice groups or your mediation, your night patrols, that sort of having those sort of skills in mediation and interacting with people would
Yeah, so...
prevention of crime and resolving.
Yeah, the The Maoron project had attendees from a wide range of NGOs and government organisations. I actually think from memory that we had a judge from the High Court of Australia that came and completed the process. But we had community members from Yolngu communities, from the different tribal groups within the Yolngu Nation. And we also had some people from Mount Theo, from the Kuruji Council at Larjamanu, and from the mediation group at Yuendamu, who attended and performed part of that, or who attended and were part of that process as well.
And perhaps as a bit of a plug for Nadia, who I'm here on behalf of. Nadia, in the past 18 months, it has been, including the assistance of people like Justine Davis that you mentioned, have been delivering mediation training in a number of communities to try and have more Aboriginal people in those communities with those skills.
Yep.
Is your view that continuing that sort of approach and resourcing that sort of thing would be beneficial in your experience in community policing?
You want me to give a plug for Naja getting a bit of a budget increase?
Well, a plug for the idea of
I agree 100%. Sorry for my response, but I agree 100%. I think that Justine and her group in Darwin and John, her husband, are doing some pretty amazing work. As a police officer, I'm 100% supportive of community-based programs and processes to divert peaceful people from the course of justice. And this is an issue that I see in the Northern Territory, is there's not a lot of focus on crime prevention. And when I'm talking crime prevention, I'm not talking from a policing perspective, I'm talking from a community-based perspective. So there's a lot of situations in the community that can be dealt with within the community that aren't criminal matters, that don't need to be brought to the attention of police until it reaches a point where an offence has been committed or a suspected offence has been committed. So I'll give you an example. On a night shift in Alice Springs, there might be 35 domestic violence call-outs. 20 of those may be verbal arguments between parties. Do I think that police intervention is required? Well, going by our process and by legislative process, yes, absolutely. Do I think there's better options? 100%. And those options could come from a wide range of services that are trained to perform that intervention before police are required. I think police are used as a stopgap to respond to nearly every incident that happens within our communities. I mean, I've been to incidents of as simple as two brothers arguing over a pair of thongs. That's required police intervention. So any training.
How did you resolve it? Did you cut them in half?
I gave them one thong. I gave them one thong each, Your Honour. but on a serious note, that's the reality of the police. I wouldn't say that we're overwhelmed, but we're pretty busy. And in answer to your question, any program that can assist the community to deal with those situations on a community level before police intervention is required would be fantastic and beneficial.
Just to quote one of your colleagues, we can't arrest our way out of many of these problems that we've discussed. It's broader than simply.
I think if we've come to the point where we think we're going to arrest our way out of a social issue, that we're kidding ourselves. I think that the issues that we're facing in the Northern Territory are much more complex and much bigger than any policing service is ever going to be able to deal with. And I don't think that that's the role of police within society. Police shouldn't be there to be parents. They shouldn't be there to be referees, they shouldn't be there to be social workers, they shouldn't be there to be psychologists. Unfortunately, we're the response agency that's there and available to deal with all those situations. So if you have a probationary constable who's been at the police college for 35 weeks, they get deployed to their first workstation. On their first day, they could be dealing with a hostage situation, they could be dealing with a death, they could be dealing with a murder. Do we adequately prepare them enough for the situations that we deal with? No, I don't think that we do, because the knowledge that they need to deal with every situation they're going to be faced with is gained through immersion and experience. It can't be taught. So it's, yeah.
Perhaps just clarifying, since we've mentioned her name, you do understand Justine Davis is also involved in working and supporting the Community Justice Centre, which is also part of the American government. Just touching on the aspects of what you just said then, did your experience that when you are dealing with an offender or perhaps a young person, that having the assistance of somebody from their community that has knowledge and training in mediation or works for some sort of cultural authority, an offender, particularly a young person, is more likely to kind of go along with what's happening to them if someone, there's an elder or someone from the community involved or assisting police.
Yeah, it makes a massive...
Make your job easier, I suppose.
Well, it makes a massive difference. And yes, it does make our job easier. If I think, and I may be wrong in this quote, but one of the quotes that we use is that a successful policing operation can be judged by the level of force used or the level of force minimised. So it's not like we are going out to use force in our everyday work. Personally, I've been here for 2 years. In that time, I've been a general duties member, a watch house sergeant, acting watch house sergeant for an extended period. I've worked in remote communities. I've performed duties with Strike Force Viper, and I currently work in domestic family violence unit. I think from memory I've used force on 3 occasions. So the greatest asset that I have in my duties is my ability to hold a conversation. And I think that that's maybe somewhere where we need additional training.
You touched on Dr. Dwyer's question in relation to WIDAC and rehab services and the like. We spoke to someone from Kumanjayi family members that are involved in WIDAC. They and discussed the things such as additional resources for on-country community rehabilitation or residential programs and the like. Is that something that you think would be beneficial, having people, young people being able to do those sort of programs, in compliance with court orders, etc., on country, run by people in their community?
Absolutely. I think that we, in Australia, this is from my limited understanding of our prison system, but we seem to be following along the lines of an Americanised prison system. United States, the most highly incarcerated nation on the face of the earth, we're not far behind. Do we incarcerate people without looking at other options that are available to try and divert that person from incarceration, taking them away from their family, culture, country? No, we don't. Do I think we could do it better? Yes, I do. I don't work for corrections and I'm not in government, but I don't think that it's done correctly. And I think that we're at a point in time now where we've been doing the same thing for a very long time. If we're a football club and we were training the same way and losing the way that we are, we wouldn't be in the competition anymore. Do I think we need to look at other alternatives? Absolutely. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes, it does. Thank you. You've touched on poverty as an underlying problem. We've heard from other officers that have given evidence, including at the level of sergeant, around their views or perceptions of Aboriginal people. Questions were asked around their understanding of poverty in Aboriginal communities, remote and in town. I suppose this is the question of how do we address this with the sort of perceptions. Does it concern you, and what do you think is the solution when officers at that level don't have an understanding about it and simply answer those sort of questions as the poverty, look at all the green cans and simply don't have a broader understanding, can't see past alcohol being jostling is a problem, but can't see past those sort of issues.
I think it's a bit more deep-seated than what a lot of the Australian population thinks it is when it comes to the issue of poverty, because poverty's not just monetarily based, it's opportunity based, it's education based, it's culture based, it's inclusion in wider society. But I've worked in 2 countries in the world where I've dealt with people of distinctly different cultures to me, and they had similar social issues to what we see in the Northern Territory, and the social issues were all based around they were all poverty based. They were based around access to food, money, education, security, safety, which is something that we don't, as an Australian people, we don't consider enough in our day-to-day dealings. And I see that quite often with a lot of our youth offenders in Alice Springs, where they don't have a safe home to go to, they don't have food at home. Home could be a very dysfunctional place, frequented by high number of visitors from different family groups, different areas. So we find the kids on the street at 3 o'clock in the morning committing offences against the rest of community. But a lot of the time when I speak to those kids, it's an expression of their sense of hopelessness, because they don't have the safety and they don't have the opportunities that some of us are being privileged to in our day-to-day lives. So I think some people may misinterpret the use of that word poverty-based as being based around people being poor, but it's more than just being poor monetarily. It's being poor in a multiple number of factors that lead to a sense of hopelessness and a lack of ambition. Does that?
Yeah, I guess just going on from that, is it something that concerns you or just hardens you to think that one of your colleagues, served in this town for more than 10 years, wouldn't be able to see those issues and would simply think it's a lifestyle choice of alcoholism and not understand the importance of having an understanding of those sort of underlying issues.
It doesn't disappoint me, but it doesn't surprise me, and it's probably something that couldn't be addressed through a conversation, because a lot of, even though people live in Alice Springs, work in Alice Springs, and are here day to day, their actual interactions with people that are marginalised within our community is limited. So if you're a police officer and you come to work every day and you do your job, unfortunately you deal predominantly with a cross-section of the community that's in crisis. You don't always get to meet the good people in the community unless you're working remotely. So Yeah, you could say the same thing about a non-Indigenous white family living in Campbelltown in Sydney who's third, fourth, fifth generation unemployed, who faces similar adversities in their day-to-day life to what our people do here. It's not the situation that we've got in relation to the poverty issue. It's not unique to Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. It is an issue that affects people in every cross-section of society, in multiple countries across the face of the earth. And if you look at the crime types and the social order and the substance and alcohol abuse types, it's similar across the board, irrelevant of culture, ethnicity or religion.
As someone that provides cultural knowledge to recruits, knowing that there's more senior officers that, and as you said, a lot of officers see the negative aspects. Is there a requirement for ongoing and regular cross-cultural?
Oh, absolutely. I think you misquoted me there when you said that a lot of officers see the negatives. All of us see the negatives in our role, because that's police. I explained it to my wife one day. I came home and I was a bit down about what I was dealing with on that day. And I said, sometimes I feel like I don't go to work to have a good day. Because when I go to work and I put on my uniform, I'm always dealing with a crisis. I'm always going to deal with somebody when they're at a low ebb in their life. I'm always going to deal with them when they're having a mental health break, or when they're suffering from some issue that requires intervention. You know, people don't ring you up because they're happy. They don't ring the police because they're happy. So our involvement with the community is totally different to everybody else's involvement with the community. So it can impact the way that you look at and think about and deal with the cross-section of society that you immediately deal with. Reminding yourself that that's a small cross-section of the community is what's important. Because if you focus wholly and solely on what you're doing at work and you're not socialising, not being a part of the community that you're involved with, then you can become focused on the negative.
Would you say there's, in looking at her on make recommendations, that there's a role in policing in actively countering exactly what you've talked about, active measures to ensure people do have positive interactions and learn positive things about the community that you work with and that you interact with?
Yes, and it's something that I've seen encouraged by long-serving senior members of Northern Territory Police. When I came through my recruit squad, my advanced recruiting program, we had Sergeant Owen Blackwell as our squad officer, and it was something that he spoke very strongly and passionate about, was you need to be a part of your community. And he spoke about his service and what he had done in the Central Desert, in Groot Island, in Arnhem Land, and how he had integrated himself into the community. So every community that he went to, he was involved with the local football team. He got involved with community events, community issues. I think that's really important for us in our role. So I know that there's senior police that are encouraging and explaining that through the recruitment process. Do I think there's a need for it to be addressed regularly? Yeah, absolutely. Because we need to remind ourselves that not everybody in our community is negative or in crisis.
And given that we've also heard other police also talk about those sort of negative crisis interactions, there's a risk that it can lead towards negative stereotyping of Aboriginal people, racist views and that sort of things we've heard. Your positive comments about the improvements in the anti-police upon returning in your role. You agree that it's important for that factor to prevent people slipping into the older ways of having these sort of racist or negative views.
Absolutely. I don't think the type of language, and I know you're referring back to some of the text message stuff, that type of language would not be accepted in the muster room at Alice Springs Police Station, I can tell you directly. I haven't heard it. Whether that's because people wouldn't be game to say it in front of me because they know that they would get a response. But there's enough, there's not enough, but there's a lot of Aboriginal police officers that work within the station. I'm not the only one that feels that it's a pretty good environment. Do we have issues? Yes, absolutely. Can we become negative? Yes, absolutely. And I've seen that across multiple jurisdictions where you have to remind yourself that you're dealing with a small section of society and not everybody will behave that way.
And that brings me to another point. You're aware of many of the other Aboriginal police officers. Is there enough done, or is there more that could be done in supporting or making Aboriginal people feel more confident and more comfortable working within police?
There's plenty more that could be done. Do I think NT Police are trying their best in the current circumstances? Yes. Do I think there's room for improvement? Yes.
For example, other government departments have created internal Aboriginal advisory or reference groups within their agencies. Is that something that has been done or could be done?
Well, Northern Territory Police have set up the Community Resilience Engagement Command, the CREC, which addresses that question in total, and I spoke about that the last time I gave evidence.
And certainly from the outside, there is a perception, or there could be a perception in the community that this whole experience of this inquest and racism that's arisen just creates a division within the agencies. Is that something that more could be done to address that and ensure not only the public but the people like yourself or my Aboriginal officers?
I wouldn't say it's created division within the agency. What I would say is that it's identified that there was a behavioural type. We know that. Acknowledging that behaviour occurred and ensuring going forwards that behaviour is addressed and not tolerated is what's important. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yes, it does. Would that just finally include strong messaging from senior officers that racism is not tolerated?
Well, I think that's, for me, if you're a senior officer and you allow that to happen, then you're failing in your role of leadership. And that's non-questionable.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Martin. I'm from the Park Group Committee in the Moon, and so it's a Justice Committee. What I want to do is build on the questions and answers you've already been asked, with a particular focus on reimagining, to some extent, the preparation of younger police officers. You're probably not that surprised to know, given the way today's unfolded, you've been the most unusual witness in the inquest in terms of the range of issues you've been asked to consider. And it's because you're one of the only witnesses who has one of the small number of witnesses who has a whole life of living in two worlds, as you put it. And it's clear from what you've said today that you made it clear to us the enormous complexity of the job of being a police officer in the Northern Territory. And many of us in this court are not from the Northern Territory, and this complexity of your job sounds more complex than some of the jobs that other police officers in other parts of Australia might do. And you think that's probably right based on your national experience in the AFP?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's what I want to bring you to focus on. Because you made a comment a few minutes ago that when you arrive at a job, sometimes there's a level of violence and brutality which is really confronting.
Yep.
And you have to make a decision in a nanosecond about what you're going to do next. And you said that the way that you deal with that might well be different from the way others deal with it, based on your entire life experience.
That's correct.
Yeah. So that's where I'm going with these questions, because even though the Northern Territory Police might now have, you said roughly 14%, give or take a few percent, of people who are of Aboriginal heritage, nevertheless, they're still going to leave, even in the best of times, 60 or 70% of the police force who are not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
I think about 86, yeah.
At the moment, but even with much change and much
Yep.
progress, there's still going to be a huge percentage of people who are not Aboriginal.
Yep.
So, bearing those preliminary remarks in mind, and perhaps one other comment to give a foundation for these questions. We already know that almost every kid in detention in the Northern Territory is Aboriginal.
Yes.
It swings between 95 and 100% currently.
Yep.
And around 85% of the 1,800 or so people in prison at any one time are going to be Aboriginal.
Yes.
So most of the people who are dealt with in these crises that you have been referring to are in fact Aboriginal people.
That's correct.
So none of my questions now should be taken as criticisms of the police training, which it's clear from what we're all learning is changing and improving.
Yes.
But we're at the point where you've got a course of approximately 26 or so weeks at the academy. I appreciate you're only a very small part of that and you're not a member of staff, but that won't stop you answering these questions. We're at the point where about 6 or 7 days of that training is called by other witnesses here, training about Aboriginal culture and so on.
Yep.
So I want to suggest to you that one way of reimagining the training that the officers have, the young constables have, probationary constables to be precise, is that it be far richer and far more extensive than what has previously been conceived. And I'll give you some examples. And I know you're not qualified in terms of budgetary decisions or management decisions, but what you are qualified in is what none of us are qualified in, is being on the street, either in community or in town, dealing with a huge range of issues. And that's one of the things I'm coming back to, because you pointed out that a policeman in your job in Alice Springs or community is sometimes not just a policeman, but also perhaps a parent or a social worker, or even dealing with medical situations, a psychologist.
Yep.
And you made the point a number of times that it shouldn't be that way, that there should be far greater resources coming from other agencies to deal with problems. And I'm sure no one will disagree with you on that. But the reality is, because of the way this territory operates, and the community's interaction with those other agencies and police, it is a fact that it's the police who are called to this huge and wide range of problems on a daily basis. So I want to suggest to you that in order for the young non-Aboriginal constable in the future to deal with the realities which you've described and the wide range of needs and challenging situations, that it's time to reimagine entirely the training, so that all of the things that are taught in order to be a constable carrying a weapon, to fill out a notebook, to go to court and give evidence, all of those things, of course, must be taught well. But in addition to that, instead of having 5 or 6 or 7 days of training in Aboriginal culture and matters, such as the things that are in your video, that 2.5-hour video that's on our group, that there should be more like 5 or 6 or 7 weeks of training. And that's what I want to explore with you for the moment. Now, we all know from your evidence and from the sergeant who sat with you last time, Alan, was it?
Yeah, Sergeant Allen.
And other witnesses who've spoken about their experience out in the field, that experience out in the field is essential. You need to be mentored by good people as you come up through the ranks and do training. But would you agree that, in addition to appreciating the value of that experience in the field, that there could be great value in a constable having a much wider, richer and deeper understanding of Aboriginal history and culture before they even step out into the field?
I won't disagree with that.
And can I suggest that some of it ought to be confronting for the young police constable? For instance, we often hear in this court, we've heard talk of the Coniston massacre, and I've seen there's police training information about the Coniston massacre, which is particularly relevant, of course, to this case and the Walker pit. But to your knowledge, for instance, is there education at the academy or in any part of your training as a police officer on what followed the Coniston massacre, such as an inquiry where it was found that the deaths were justified, that the killings were justified, an inquiry where Aboriginal witnesses weren't called, where police lied, and where effectively the whole thing is whitewashed?
I'm an R&D man. I know the history of my own people. You don't have to tell me.
So I appreciate that you will know much more about this than I ever will. But I'm now thinking about the young non-Aboriginal constable who in 27 weeks is going to be at Yindamu or Alice or Catherine or whatever.
Could I suggest that you're saying that that needs to be incorporated into police training? How aware were you of these situations before you became involved with this case?
For me, not at all.
Exactly. So do you think that it's something that should be dealt with by the education system through primary school and high school by teaching people the history of this nation rather than putting it in the hands of a uniform?
Absolutely, but they're not mutually exclusive. I totally agree that and we won't be able to explore this for more than 30 seconds because we're getting off track, but the national education system obviously has failed in this area over our entire lifetimes. Maybe not today with the youngest people, but certainly in my education. And for instance, at law schools across the country, there are 11 core subjects, and none of them are the law of the Aboriginal people, however that might be taught. So you won't have any argument for me about all that. But what we have to deal with here is the facts on the ground that you described, that nanosecond when you're confronting a difficult situation, and also the situations which are not crises, but which require maturity and depth of understanding of culture. And because of all of your experience and the answers you've already given, that's what I want to ask you about. Do you agree that, and the Coniston's a good example, but there are many other areas, going back in time, pre-Coniston, the Northern Territory Mounted Police, subsequent to Coniston, the matters of slavery, of being forced to work without wages, of decades of living in those circumstances. Do you agree that the constables would greatly benefit if that was taught to them in quite a serious and in-depth way, so that when they go out into the field, they'll never know what you know, and I'll never know what you know, but they'll have a much better understanding than they currently do?
I agree, but I think it's a matter for our nation. So, once again, it's a focus that we're putting on the police. I think it's a failure across our entire nation that we don't know that history. So yes, I think it should be incorporated into police training. I agree with you that it should be incorporated into legal training. It should be incorporated into medical training. It should be incorporated into every aspect of Australian culture so that we know the history of this land that we're sitting on. So yeah, I agree with you, but I think it needs to go further than just those that are responsible for enforcement of legislation having an understanding. I think everybody needs to.
You probably already know that I agree with what you're saying
Yep,
about that.
I do.
But what we have to do sitting at this table is to make submissions to Her Honour about findings that she can make. And building on your answer, it's not at all contradictory with your answer, is the idea that
I've agreed with you.
the people of Yuendamu and people like yourself.
Yep.
agree.
I've agreed with you, yes.
Just so I can understand that, and you've talked about, is it Marwul Rom? How do you spell that?
Mawul's M-A-W-U-L.
M-A-W-U-L.
Second word, Rom, R-O-M. So Mawul's is the Wugandi, it's the ceremony. Rom means law. So, yeah.
Is it the kind of learning that you received in Marwul Rom that you think might be of benefit for this more in-depth learning that Mr. McMahon is talking about, or is it something different to that?
Oh, possible, but that particular training is unique to Yolngu people in Northeast Arnhem Land. The ceremony comes from there, the songlines come from there, but it can be incorporated into other areas. It's just a different form of learning. So, yeah, it's conceptually, yeah, I think absolutely, Your Honour.
That could be a component of the additional learning that could be incorporated, possibly.
Possibly, or if not, exposure to non-contemporary Aboriginal learning, because modern Australia doesn't have exposure to an Aboriginal learning space or a Torres Strait Islander learning space. So, yeah, that...
So I appreciate you understand where I'm going with this, but we have to get notice on the transcript in order to make recommendations to our own side. So some of the questions I'm asking you might be a bit obvious, but that's why we do it.
Mm-hmm.
So for instance, I want to talk to you about poverty on the one hand and enforcing legislation as a separate point.
Yep.
You've made some quite profound comments about poverty and how in order to understand some of the young people that you see on the street at 3 a.m, you have to go into the whole of their life, which to try to understand properly how you're going to deal with that young person. This you probably do intuitively on a daily basis or regularly.
Mm-hmm.
To understand poverty, you have to understand, in Northern Territory at least, or Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, you have to understand dispossession, the history of colonization. All those things are part of generations of people who have been living in poverty. And I'm sure that you understand again that more than people in this room will, this men, because you've seen it all of your life. So again, that area of education you would agree that that kind of thorough training at police college in understanding the history of poverty in the Aboriginal community and how it links to suffering in other ways, through dispossession, through disempowerment, for instance. You'd agree that those kinds of things could usefully be taught in depth to young police constables coming through, so that they have a better understanding of the young person that they're meeting at 3 a.m. on the street.
Yeah, I won't disagree. Once again, I think that needs to be addressed at a national level, but as an immediate response, yes, it would be beneficial.
You may remember last time when Sergeant Allen was there, I was actually promoting these ideas as a way of promoting the Northern Territory Police as an agency of excellence.
Mhm.
That if the sorts of ideas that we're discussing now were part of the training of the Northern Territory policemen, that picks up the idea that you're saying this is a national problem, but look at the way we're dealing with it. This police force is now dealing with this in a reimagined, unique, thorough, creative and powerful way. That would be a good way of attracting quality people into the Northern Territory Police, actually.
Yep, I agree.
You spoke earlier, you said that America is the most incarcerated nation on earth. I think it's something over 2.5 million people in prison.
That's correct.
However, it's often said that the Aboriginal people of Australia are the most incarcerated people on earth.
That's correct.
And it seems that we should at least consider that in the context of some of the questions and answers that I've heard today. You spoke about, you said a number of times what the police do is they respond to a call and they're enforcing legislation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but built into some of your answers was a plea to the Parliament that there would be more discretion built into the decision-making processes for police officers.
I wouldn't say it was for more discretion. I would say that it's a plea from my perspective, it's a plea for a government response to deal effectively with the social issues that put people in contact with the justice, with justice. So that puts people into contact with the police, that puts people into contact with the court. Because that's the underlying factor of why so many Aboriginal people are incarcerated in Australia, is because as a nation we're not dealing with the history, with the poverty, with the issues that we've got day to day going forward. That's why. There's no police officer that I know that comes into work every day and says, I'm going to go and lock up an Aboriginal today, because you don't have the time. You come into work, and if you're working general duties, you answer the radio call to go to the dead child, to go to the car accident, to go to the domestic, to go to the stabbing. You don't ask whether it's a white or a black or an ethnic person that you're going to respond to. You respond to the job and you deal with the situation that you've got in front of you.
Sure. So I'm not suggesting to you that there's a desire to go out and arrest Aboriginal people.
No, and I know that, but what I'm trying to establish is that the amount of Aboriginal people that come into contact with the police is dictated to by the situation that my people are in socially.
And I think you've made that point very powerfully, but it does tie into your comment, which you've made a number of times, that you're enforcing the law. And for instance, 30 years ago, the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Vets in Custody made a whole lot of recommendations, and the number of Aboriginals in custody at that time was noted and so on.
That's
but in
correct.
fact, the situation has got noticeably worse.
It has, but if you look at the recommendations of that Royal Commission, you'll notice that the one government organisation from all jurisdictions that has almost complied with every recommendation is the police. So I would implore you to have a look at that Royal Commission and to have a look at what government departments have not complied with the recommendations of that Royal Commission, because that might answer some of the questions about why Aboriginal people are incarcerated at such a high rate. It might answer some of your questions about why Aboriginal people are dealt with at such high levels by the police.
Well, part of the answer to that is going to be that when a good police officer goes out and enforces the law according to his or her obligations and duty, those laws are actually leading to high rates of incarceration.
Yep, I won't disagree with that. But the reason why those people may be breaking those laws could be fundamentally brought back to the poverty, hunger, disengagement, disenfranchised, everything that we've spoken about, which hasn't been dealt with by education, by health. I mean, I had a conversation during the break with a person who was going to deal with Purple House, and Purple House is an amazing foundation that does amazing work across the desert. And I said, the thing that saddens me is that Purple House is so good, but the fact that so many of my family require renal treatment is so bad.
The underlying causes that send people to Purple House are not properly addressed.
Exactly. So the underlying reasons why people come into contact with the police and the Justice Department, it's exactly the same concept, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And can I suggest to you, that's actually why I'm asking these questions, that in order for another policeman without your rich life experience to make that same observation, it includes a much more profound education on the issues that we've been talking about.
Yes.
And if the schools aren't doing it, at least what I would like to be saying for my client, and I think you would say the same thing, is that at least if they go into the Northern Territory Police and they're going to exercise the duties of a police officer, at least there, they will get some serious education on these issues.
Yep.
And you'd agree that that's a good approach?
Absolutely.
All right. I think I've done my time. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Senior Constable Wallace. My name is Hutton, and I appear on behalf of NT Health. I too just wanted to pick up on one of the earlier points of your evidence today. This morning, that was, you said to Dr. Dwyer that you consider clinic nurses who work remotely do an amazing job.
Yes.
And that evidence will be gratefully received by my clients. I'm interested to hear why that is your view.
If police work in a challenging environment, then health staff work in a challenging environment. The health issues that I see within my own family group, the chronic diseases, the illnesses that come about from substance abuse by right down to the basic level of diabetes in communities, it's a very challenging environment. So the clinic staff that I've come into contact with working remote are dedicated, amazing people, and some of them have been long term. Like I know some nurses that have been 20, 25 years working remotely. They're invested in the communities. They are there to perform their job in a very challenging environment. I don't have enough praise for remote nursing staff because they don't have to work outside their comfort zone or work outside of a capital city. There's a shortage of nurses across the nation, but we seem to attract a group of people who want to work in the bush. That's why I say that they're amazing, because with their skills, they could be employed anywhere in this country, yet they choose to work in the bush with my people, my family. So, yeah, that's why I consider them to be amazing.
Thank you.
I have no questions, right?
Thank you. Anything arising, Mr. Coleridge? Senior Constable, thank you again. As with the last occasion you were here, everyone, and most importantly the inquest process itself, and no doubt the findings have greatly benefited from the level of willingness that you've provided to share some very important messages and learnings with us, and thank you again.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Adjourn till 9:30 tomorrow.
Others, yeah.